is the global head of thought leadership and market strategy for Invesco. And he will speak to us today on the key technologies leading to net zero. Hello and welcome, Dr. Henning Stein.
Thank you, Alicia, for the introduction. Thank you, everyone, for joining me today and for taking part in this really great event as a whole. Happy to be here to talk about net zero and some of the innovative technologies that could help us achieve this crucial global goal. By net zero, of course, I mean net zero carbon emissions, which is a growing number of countries really hoping to achieve by 2050. And for context, we first need to quickly wind back to the Paris Agreement of 2015 and its underpinning aim of limiting global temperature rise. The dream target, and it probably is a dream still, is to restrict the average rise by the end of the century to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And net zero has emerged as a key pillar of this quest, and it's increasingly becoming a stated objective for governments and businesses alike. So the good news is that the conversation around the climate crisis has actually shifted dramatically since Paris, and it's shifting for the better or to the better. Net zero is high on the global agenda, and the related importance of clean energy innovation is gaining ever more recognition. We are now steadily working towards a green industrial revolution, as I call it, in which almost the entire physical economy will be decarbonized. And this will encompass how we make things, how we get around, how we produce food, and of course, how we generate power. The bad news is that this process of transformation isn't happening quickly enough. And this is the case pretty much right across the board. If you look, let me give you a quick example that's routinely overlooked in debates, how we can significantly cut greenhouse gas emissions. A new intergovernmental panel actually on climate change estimates the global food system is responsible for up to 42% of all greenhouse gas emissions. And research has also found more than 14% of all greenhouse gases come from livestock alone, with cattle obviously accounting for the vast majority of this total. So we can see there's little realistic hope of achieving net zero without radically reforming our approach to food and agriculture. Actually, meat consumption worldwide is going up. But what about energy? Well, the energy sector emits 33 gigatons of CO2 each year, which actually makes it the largest greenhouse gas emitting sector of all. As the slide says, there is potential to significantly reduce this figure by transitioning to renewables and other low carbon energy sources. And as we can also see here, emission reductions through 2030 could largely come from technologies that are actually already on the market. But almost half the reduction needed by 2050 will come from technologies that are currently not on the market, that are in the demonstration or in the prototype phase, if you will. So we might say net zero represents arguably the greatest challenge facing the innovators and entrepreneurs, both today and tomorrow. We might also say it represents arguably the most spectacular growth opportunity in the investment community has ever accounted. I hope we might say as well that there's a good chance many of you will actually play a role in ensuring this vital transition takes place. We can expect a wide range of clean energy solutions to help realize the journey to net zero during the years and decades ahead. And some are likely to be the result of radical innovation, which is to say, they will use novel technologies that qualify as real game changers. And the problem always with radical innovation is that it very rarely secures support from policymakers. at least not until it's been proven. A good example actually is geoengineering. I mean, it's a fascinating area. This is a technology that policymakers have so far tended to avoid considering. And their aversion basically stems from a fear of the relatively unknown, if you will, and a belief that people could be distracted from avoiding emissions. Geoengineering can include things like spraying seawater thousands of meters into the air to seed then the formation of clouds that will deflect sunlight. It can also involve stuff like installing sun shields or mirrors in space actually to reflect the sun rays. Or it can entail injecting sun-blocking particles into space itself. Switzerland, where I'm actually based, has been asking the United Nations to at least consider these ideas to help fight climate change. But policymaking community has consistently dismissed such groundbreaking technologies as being too radical, even dangerous. And this really leaves us mainly with what I call incremental innovation. That's an approach that builds and improves on technologies that already exist. And that's where we are focusing on today. And even though I'm here, I'm a great believer in radical innovation and would like to see much more of that as well. Invesco recently produced a report exploring 4 clean energy technologies that are relatively well established and close to deployment. They're carbon capture, usage, and storage. That's also known as CCUS. That is hydrogen, and that is grid scale energy storage. And number 4 is advanced nuclear power. We chose these because we believe each could represent an important realistic stepping stone to next generation net zero technologies. Just as importantly, they could or should actually present significant commercial and investment opportunities as the road to net zero unfolds. So let's take a quick look at each of them in turn and considering not just their potential, but some of the challenges around implementing them at scale. Go next slide. Let's start with carbon capture technology. And this works by actually capturing, as the word implies, capturing the CO2 from power generation and other industrial processes. So the principle is quite simple. Once captured, the emissions are used as inputs in other processes or permanently stored underground. Theoretically, then we could capture and use the carbon emissions from, let's say, a power plant. In fact, the technology to do this already exists. So by way of further illustrating this, consider plastic. By using captured carbon, we could turn plastic actually into net negative emission products. In effect, we would be taking away and storing more carbon inside plastic than we would be releasing. Wouldn't that be something? I mean, the International Energy Agency has predicted most CO2 emissions will eventually be captured from gas, coal, and biomass plants. And the main problem at present is that the process isn't nearly as cheap as using fossil fuels. So it isn't especially effective yet either. The rates of capture will need to increase from now it's 40 megatons to 800 megatons by the end of this decade to really make a meaningful contribution to net zero. And really the true innovative CCUS technologies are today still at the pilot stage. In addition, the market for captured CO2 is quite small. So how might these barriers be overcome, you ask? And our report identified a number of key approaches necessary to implement CCUS at scale. First, the process itself needs to be improved. Enhanced power cycles, heat recovery, and intensification should then reduce costs. Second, policymakers can encourage progress by really offering CCUS-friendly processes, friendly incentives, regulation, helping then implement these as standards, if you will. Next, we have hydrogen energy. At least at present, this is basically a story of enormous potential, but equally significant costs because it burns clean. Hydrogen actually could help decarbonize various sectors, but its ability to actually curb emission depends on how you produce it. So that's what you see here, the different types of hydrogen on the slide, right? Over 90% of the current global production is what we call gray hydrogen. And this is produced actually from fossil fuels, such as natural gas, coal, and oil. So on the one side, gray hydrogen is super cheap, super low cost, which is good. But on the other side, gray hydrogen is responsible for annual CO2 emissions equal to those of Indonesia and the UK combined. Gray hydrogen combined with CCUS, what I was talking earlier, is known as what we call blue hydrogen. And this still results in emissions escaping into the atmosphere, but it's better than gray. And then you go to green. Green hydrogen is produced with renewable energy and water electrolysis, and it results in zero emissions, but still it's very costly at this point. Finally, nuclear power and biomass that could also produce low carbon hydrogen. Work in these fields is still at the early stage, at the early concept stage. Hydrogen could meet a quarter of all energy needs by 2050, but it requires major infrastructure investment and also government support. And we're seeing some of that support already, for example, in the EU. The third technology featured in our report is grid-scale energy storage, and this is a concept that is already well established and it's also commercialized. And the idea here is to store electrical energy when supply is high and demand is low, and then turn it to the grid when demand actually goes up when it's high. And this is already achieved through what's called pumped storage hydropower, PSH, which accounts for almost 95% of installed energy storage capacity. The main drawbacks of PSH are restrictive geographic requirements. You get some very high upfront costs in your CapEx, and you also have a little bit disruption in the river systems that you need to overcome. The second commercialized form of storage is batteries. And this approach is obviously already deployed all over the world, actually at scale in the US, you see Europe, Japan, Australia. Batteries are very efficient and increasingly cheap, but their storage duration is limited. So they can also bring environmental and social impacts. Grid scale energy storage is attracting growing interest from the private sector. A fund in Australia recently announced a project valued at $2.4 billion US. And governments also looking into grid scale energy storage. They're playing their part. For example, right now, the US Department of Energy is establishing a $75 million US facility just to research this technology more. Finally, let's look at advanced nuclear technologies. These take the form of small modular reactors and advanced modular reactors. So small nuclear reactors, SMRs, they're based on the traditional light water reactor design, if you will. They could be developed on a smaller scale. And then you go to advanced modular reactors. They're still under development. They use new cooling systems as they also use fuels such as molten salt. Both the SMRs and the AMRs produce clean, low carbon energy. Both could also be scaled up and down depending on your energy demand. And it's estimated that nuclear power production, including advanced nuclear, must increase by 80% by 2040 to meet really clean energy goals. There are also some crucial limitations that will need to be overcome if we are to harness the full potential of this technology. One is a lack of market readiness, which I already mentioned, that can deter investors, right? Another is the long-standing public opposition to nuclear power in places like Germany, where I come from. That really goes back to the 1980s. And then you had obviously the accident in Japan a couple of years ago. Cost is also a concern. The lack of economies of scale means AMRs would need to be manufactured by the thousands, which isn't yet possible. Just from considering these 4 examples, we can see actually the journey to net zero presents both massive opportunity and a major challenge. And this slide gives us an idea of the scale of the latter. It shows the size of the investment needed to achieve net zero by 2050. And in short, clean energy investment worldwide must triple by 2030 to over 4 trillion a year. 4 trillion a year, that's a high number, if we want to accomplish this global goal, right? Around 30% of this will come additional investment to come from public sources, and the 70% will come from the private sector. With this in mind, I would like to round off by discussing in a little more detail some of the pathways for financing the road to net zero. We already touched on the importance of government funding. Other pathways include green bonds and high-risk investing. Here I would like to briefly focus on 2 pathways that I think are of particular interest to young entrepreneurs of today and tomorrow. The first, crowdfunding, is increasingly helpful for many startups. Second, venture capital is often key to rapid commercialization. Crowdfunding involves collective funding from a wide range of investors, and it's a less explored but growing source of investment in clean energy. Anyone from accredited investors to individuals wishing to invest just $100 or less can actually use this vehicle to support startups and other projects. The key benefit is its role in backing businesses in regions that attract little venture capital and have less access to conventional financial institutions. It's also helpful for projects that actually don't expect to deliver, the quick returns that we would traditionally expect as investors in a venture capital fund. As the journey to net zero continues to unfold, there are many budding crowdfunding platforms supporting clean energy initiatives. For example, Proton Technologies, which is based in Canada, has used Wayblaze to raise funds for its clean hydrogen business. They're basically applying proven oil and gas methods, and this allows for the production of hydrogen from existing oil reservoirs, so without any emissions. So in broad terms, think about 70% of oil actually remains in ground after production. So Proton uses this stranded resource to then produce hydrogen. And this technology could have widespread application across the Canadian and North Sea resource landscapes. Take the German green hydrogen company Enapter as another great example. They launched a crowdfunding campaign to help develop mass production of its hydrogen generators, and they completely rethought the whole electrolyzer process. So where others make industrial engineering projects, they actually manufacture standardized plug-and-play products. So what they do is actually deploy green hydrogen rapidly with easy installation and simple software integration. Crowdfunding has also been used for nuclear technologies. If you look at the British company Moltex Energy, it's very interesting. They raised £6 million through crowdfunding. What they do is recycling waste from existing nuclear power stations and then use it to produce more clean energy. And they can store energy supplied to the grid as needed, enabling intermittent renewables. What are intermittent renewables? These are also sometimes referred to as variable renewable energy sources. In other words, renewable energy sources that are not dispatchable due to the fluctuation nature. So, for example, wind power, solar power. So Moltex also produces heat for hydrogen, and they replace the need for fossil fuels in heating. Very, very interesting company. Climate tech investment by venture capital or VC is also on the up. As we can see here, it rose from 480 million to more than 16 billion actually in 2019, and still increasing today. So it's mounted to 16 billion in the first half of last year alone. And most deals have tended to focus on the US and Canada, followed by China and Europe. So there's still a marked geographical skew, if you will. Venture capital represents only a fraction of total capital investment in the sector, but there are compelling examples across the space. For example, in 2020, there was a venture capital-backed CCUS startup that took over 300 million US dollars. They included companies such as Carbon Clean and Venture Capital Fuel. You have Hydrogen One Capital is the world's it's the world's first clean hydrogen focused investment fund. Also raised 100 million after launching last July. And all the big tech companies, take Amazon, Microsoft, but also on the tech, on the energy side, Saudi Aramco, BP, they all have their own venture capital funds that are really worth looking into if you're an entrepreneur and you're looking to raise capital. The fact that net zero projects are now moving from concept to demonstration and even to commercialization should excite us all. Last year I attended COP26, came away feeling very optimistic about what can be achieved despite some of the event's negative headlines. Still a lot to be done in terms of the energy goals, etc. This means continuous, sometimes radical innovation. It also means more investment, a rise nearly 300% between now and 2050, according to estimates, is needed. And it means working in close collaboration with a range of other stakeholders, including the policymaking and the regulatory communities. And as I said earlier, this could be both the greatest challenge and the greatest opportunity for ever known. We need to embrace both, I think. Before I sign off, there's one last thought I would like to leave you with, and I hope that as young entrepreneurs, you'll appreciate what I'm about to say. It's easy for many people to think the change we have been talking about will never happen and the status quo will just somehow stagger on. And that's what you actually read on the news. And I've spoken today about how the journey to net zero is unfolding quickly enough, is actually not unfolding quickly enough in the eyes of many people. I think not just in energy, but we see that in other sectors. So the question is, will we see the necessary acceleration in progress ever come? I think it will, because history tells us crisis can be a powerful catalyst for change. And I remember when I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, when the hottest environmental issue was acid rain destroying our forests, soil, fish population, and scientists, policymakers, politicians were engaging in heated battles over this issue, just like today with climate change. And guess what? We found a solution to the problem. Governments all over the world passed a series of Clean Air Acts, establishing a cap and trade system designed to control sulfur dioxide emissions. Another big topic back then was the depletion of the ozone layer. The ozone hole, right, developed because people polluted the atmosphere with chemicals containing chlorine and bromine, CFCs for short. And the ban came into effect in '89. And guess what? Ozone levels stabilized by the mid-90s and began to recover in the 2000s. And I think two factors may explain why we heard so much about the harmful effects of both acid rain and ozone hole, and then so little about our successful mitigation. First, economic solutions often become baked in a system integrated into our economy, and that creates an invisible fix, if you will, not apparent to most people. And second, journalists just don't like to cover good news stories. It doesn't gather our attention, our emotional response the way bad news does. So my point here is, let's talk about more the technologies I covered today and what governments and the private sector can do to make these a reality. And let's focus less on all the dreadful climate change stories we read about every day. Recent history has supplied us maybe with the clearest illustration yet of this truth. I mean, look at what we achieved during COVID-19. Extraordinary circumstances, shattered normal barriers to innovation, game-changing advances, particularly in the biotech sector. And today, thanks to dynamics, supply chain issues, inflation, situation in Ukraine, we find ourselves again in a new crisis, a global energy crisis. Some people say, oh, the clean energy transition could be derailed and countries will reassess their commitments now to phase down fossil fuels. Well, I hold an alternative view, is that this crisis, at least over the longer term, will also serve as an engine of positive change. And I believe the case for clean energy has never been more compelling, and the journey to net zero, far from being slowed, will actually pick up pace. I also believe we are entering the era of energy tech, an age in which the leading energy companies will also be seen as tech companies. And speaking as someone who works in the asset management industry, I believe clean energy represents what investors call the Genesis trend. Ultimately, what clean energy represents a major lasting shift, one that should benefit billions of lives all around the world. So with this, thank you again for joining me today. Please feel free to contact me on the email address that's on the screen now, or through LinkedIn if you have any questions.
Thank you so much, Henning. Thank you, Henning, so much.
Thank you, Alicia. Take care.
Thank you for giving us hope, which is always vital and essential. Thank you so much.
Thank you.